The deed was cold in her hands. Wilhelmina Anderson stood at the window of the estate's east corridor in the gray half-light before dawn, the document pressed flat against her palms, the solicitor's wax seal unbroken at its foot. Outside, the first snow of November was settling across the Marath parkland in thin, even layers, softening the hard geometry of the ha-ha wall and filling the wheel ruts in the gravel drive. The great house behind her had not yet stirred. She could hear the far creak of the kitchen passage, the tick of the long case clock at the corridor's end, and nothing else. The deed bore her name. It bore the Duchy's formal description in Mr. Goss's neat clerk's hand. It bore the Duke of Marath's signature, written with the same level discipline he brought to everything, and it was hers. She had not expected this. She had expected very little from Marath Hall, and the house had obliged her in every particular until it stopped. She pressed one finger to the edge of the document, feeling the slight rough grain of the paper, and thought of her father. His name had been Thomas Anderson, and he had been a country solicitor in Hertfordshire for 31 years, a man of quiet method and reliable judgment who had trusted the wrong client at the wrong moment. The client had been the Duchy of Marath. The debt instruments her father had held, £12,000 in aggregate, across 3 separate transactions, across 7 years, had never been satisfied. He had carried them to the end of his life, and on the last clear morning before his death, he had pressed them into her hands and told her, with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life working in accurate language, that she was his only executor and the Duchy's only creditor of standing. The instruments were valid. The law was on her side. She had only to go to Marath Hall, audit the estate's accounts as the instruments entitled her to do, and present herself to the Duke. She had arrived 11 days ago. The carriage had deposited her at the main entrance on a Tuesday afternoon, and the footman who opened the door had looked at her traveling coat, her plain dark bonnet, and her leather document case with the undisguised assessment of a man whose employer's household was accustomed to a certain standard of visitor. He had directed her, not unkindly, to the steward's entrance. She had corrected him once, in a quiet voice, and had walked through the main door. Lady Dorothea Crail, the Dowager Duchess and the household's governing intelligence, had received her in the blue drawing-room with the formal courtesy one might extend to a county rate collector, perfectly correct, entirely cold, and precisely calibrated to communicate that the visitor's presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Lady Dorothea was a woman of 63, her silver hair dressed in the previous decade's style by preference rather than ignorance, her posture a matter of lifelong discipline rather than effort. She wore her rank the way the hall's carved stone wore the Duchy's arms above the door, as permanent decoration, not as ornament that required occasion. "Miss Anderson," she had said, with a pause before the surname that arranged the syllables into something faintly imprecise. "Miss Anderson," Mina had agreed. She had been given a room in the east wing, 2 floors above the corridor where she now stood with the deed in her hands. The room was adequate. A writing table, a candle stand, a fireplace that smoked slightly when the wind came from the north. Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper, had been the only member of the household who had spoken to her with uncomplicated directness, setting a supper tray on the writing table that first evening and informing her, without drama, that the estate ledgers would be made available in the library each morning from 7 o'clock, per the late steward's filing system, and that the head footman's name was James if she required anything. Mrs. Peel had a face like weathered kindness, creased at the corners and honest throughout, and Mina had been grateful for her in the way one is grateful for a lamp in a room that has been dark longer than expected. It was at the library table, on the 4th morning of her audit, that the full shape of the Duchy's insolvency had become clear. The estate's annual income was £300, Its annual obligations, held against a lattice of mortgages and creditor claims accumulated across 2 generations, exceeded the income by a factor that left nothing for repair, for staff wages more than 6 months forward, or for the basic maintenance of the home farm's 400 acres. The figures sat on the ledger pages with the flat authority of arithmetic. The Duchy of Meerath was not struggling. It was finished. What Mina's father's £12,000 represented, against that reckoning, was not a claim among many. It was the claim. The debt instruments, properly presented, constituted grounds for conveyance of the principal asset, the hall and its lands, in legal satisfaction of the debt. She had sat with that knowledge for 2 days before telling anyone. On the 6th evening, she had dressed for dinner as she dressed for every occasion, in the gray silk gown she had brought from Hertfordshire, which was clean and correctly cut, and showed its age at the cuffs if one looked carefully. She had not looked carefully at her own cuffs in some time. She had other things to look at. The dinner was the first occasion on which the Duke of Meerath had appeared. Ashford Crail was 37 years old, and carried his height the way the house carried its stonework, as though he had never considered the alternative. His face was the specific kind of controlled that one does not produce by effort, but by long habit. The jaw set, the gray eyes doing the room's work without offering any of themselves in return. He sat at the head of the table as a duke sat at the head of a table. Not because the chair was placed there, but because the geometry of the room rearranged itself around his presence. There were 30 people at the table. Mina had counted them from her seat near the lower end, between a retired colonel whose name she had not caught, and the young wife of a neighboring landowner who had spent the first course examining Mina's gown, with the peripheral attention of a woman who filed such observations away for later use. Miss Cecily Ford sat 3 places to the Duke's right, in a cream gown with pearl trim at the bodice, her dark hair dressed with 2 white feathers, whose placement suggested professional assistance. The remark came during the second course. A question had been posed from the table's upper half, some pleasantry about the season's assemblies, and Ashford had allowed the conversation to reach him without contributing to it, in the manner of a man who considered social exchange a tax he would pay, but not enjoy. Then Lady Dorothea had said, with the carrying clarity of a woman accustomed to being the room's primary voice, "Miss Anderson is with us in a professional capacity. I'm given to understand. She is auditing the estate accounts." The colonel beside Mina had shifted in his chair. The young wife had set down her fork. "Then the Duchy has taken to hiring its auditors from the dressmaker's remnants," Ashford said. His voice was level and unraised, the remark delivered as observation rather than cruelty, which was perhaps worse. A plain gown for a plain assignment. 30 faces did what 30 faces did in such moments. They processed the remark, made their private calculation about its safety, and moved, collectively and swiftly, away from any expression that might be read as alignment with its target. Mina did not change her expression. She had practiced that stillness her whole adult life in solicitors' offices and county court anterooms, where women were received as anomalies and made to feel the full weight of that assessment. She lifted her water glass and drank from it, set it down, and returned her attention to her plate. She thought, £12,000, and the law on my side. She did not say it. She ate her dinner. The table moved on because tables at which a duke spoke moved in the direction he pointed, and he had made his point and was done with it. But the young wife beside Mina did not quite meet her eyes again for the remainder of the evening, and the colonel said nothing further, and the meal continued with the careful social efficiency of an event whose minor unpleasantness had been processed and filed. If Mina noticed that the Duke's gaze returned to her twice more before the covers were removed, She attributed it to the category of attention a man gives to something he has decided to dismiss and cannot quite dismiss. She was not right about that, but she could not have known it yet. The audit continued. She arrived at the library each morning at 7, worked through the ledgers with the method her father had taught her, and recorded her findings in a clean notebook with the margins left wide for annotation. The numbers did not improve on closer inspection. The estate had been carrying its debt load since Ashford's father's time, compounding across decades, and the present Duke had inherited both the title and the arithmetic. £300 of annual income against obligations that exceeded it by orders of magnitude was not a management failure. It was a structural one. On the 8th morning, she was still at the library table at 3:30 in the afternoon, working by the west window's declining light, when the sound of raised voices reached her from the courtyard below. She did not intend to look. She looked. In the cobbled yard beneath the library window, Lady Dorothea stood with 2 footmen and a small girl of perhaps 8 years, the daughter of one of the home farm tenants, a child with red-chapped hands and a patched coat who was being told, in the dowager's precise, carrying voice, that the kitchen door was not a public entrance, and that children from the tenants' cottages had no business presenting themselves at the hall on a weekday morning. The child was not crying. She was standing with her chin up and her hands pressed flat against her coat seams, enduring the instruction with the specific dignity of a person who has learned that dignity is the only currency available to her. Mina closed her ledger, came down the back stairs, and walked across the courtyard. "The child's name," she said, addressing the child directly rather than the dowager. "Is what?" The girl said, "Agnes, miss. Agnes has come to return the basket the cook lent her mother last week," Mina said, because she had seen the basket in Agnes's arms and understood its significance immediately. She turned to the dowager. "The basket is the hall's property. Agnes was returning it. That is not an intrusion. That is correct conduct." Lady Dorothea looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a woman who had not expected to be contradicted in her own courtyard by someone wearing gray cuffs. "Miss Anderson," she said, with the same slight imprecision as before. "Miss Anderson," Mina agreed with the same quiet finality. She took the basket from Agnes, pressed the child's cold hand briefly between her own, and said, "Go home, Agnes. Thank your mother for returning it promptly." Agnes went. Mina did not look back toward the library windows as she walked to the kitchen entrance to deposit the basket. She did not know that Ashford was at the library window, standing where she had been standing 3 minutes earlier, watching the courtyard below with an expression that his face did not often produce. Something that sat between recognition and the specific discomfort of a man who has just been made aware of a quality he had not assigned to the person who possesses it. What she did not know was that he stood at that window for some minutes after she had gone inside, and that when he finally left the library, he left it more slowly than he had entered it. That evening, Mrs. Peel brought the supper tray as usual and sat for a moment in the chair near the door, as she sometimes did, on the pretext of ensuring the fire had drawn properly. Mina had grown to value these few minutes. Mrs. Peel did not ask questions she did not need answers to, but she answered questions freely, and she knew the house in the way that long-serving staff knew a house. Not from above, as its owners knew it, but from within, where the cold came in and the pipes failed, and the portraits accumulated dust. "The portrait in the East Gallery," Mina said after a pause. "The one turned to face the wall." Mrs. Peel considered the fire for a moment. "The late Duchess," she said. "His Grace's first wife. He turned it 6 years ago and has not asked for it to be righted since." Mina waited. "She died in childbed," Mrs. Peel said. quietly. His Grace was in London at the time. Debt negotiations, the steward said. Something urgent about the mortgages on the north parcels. She paused again. He arrived 3 days after. The child did not survive either. The fire settled in the grate. Mina did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say about that kind of grief. The kind that does not diminish but calcifies, organizing the entire surface of a person until the cold exterior is no longer performance, but architecture. She thought about a man who had been in London negotiating mortgages on £300 a year's worth of income when his wife died, and who had returned to an empty house and turned a portrait to the wall, and who had been sitting inside that calcification ever since, maintaining the Duchy's obligations with the discipline of someone paying a debt he could never fully discharge. She did not soften toward him, precisely. But she understood something she had not understood before. In the days that followed, they found themselves in the same rooms more often than the house's size should have required. The library, where she worked in the mornings, and he sometimes appeared in the late afternoons, with correspondence he had apparently not been able to address at his desk. The east corridor in the evenings, which ran between the library and the family dining room, and which both of them used as a shortcut without having discussed the convenience. The garden stone terrace on the one mild afternoon the week allowed, where she had gone to clear her head after a particularly difficult set of ledger pages, and he had appeared 10 minutes later without explanation, and stood at the wall's far end looking at the parkland with his hands linked behind his back. He did not apologize for the dinner remark. She had not expected him to. What he did, instead, was speak to her with the specific care of a man who was revising an assessment, and doing it without announcing the revision. He asked, one afternoon in the library, what methodology she was using to reconcile the North Parcels rental records against the mortgage schedule. It was a genuine question, the kind that required a genuine answer, and she gave him one. He listened without interrupting. He asked a follow-up question that was more precise than the first, and she revised her estimation of his financial understanding upward considerably. They spent 40 minutes at the library table with the ledgers between them, not as duke and auditor, but as two people who understood the same mathematics and were looking at the same problem from adjacent angles. He said, when they had established the North Parcel's correct figure, "You were correct in your initial reconciliation." "I usually am," she said, and then wondered briefly whether that had been too direct. He looked at her for a moment, and something crossed his face that was not quite amusement, and was not quite respect, and was something she did not have a ready category for. "So I am beginning to understand," he said. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was comfortable, and then returned to the ledger. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in the East Wing room and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about the quality of his attention in the library, the way he had leaned forward slightly over the reconciled figures, the brief warmth of his voice on the words, "You were correct," and she told herself with some firmness that she was a creditor conducting a lawful audit, and that the Duke of Marath's revised opinion of her professional competence was not a personal matter. Her body registered the argument and declined to accept it. It was a practical problem, she decided. She would treat it as a practical problem. She had £12,000 in debt instruments and the law on her side, and by the time she had finished with the ledger audit, she would have discharged her father's commission, and she could leave Marath Hall and never see its duke again. And that would be the end of it. She had approximately 4 days before the situation made that resolution impossible to keep. Lady Dorothea moved first. Mina learned of it not from the Dowager directly, but from the sound of voices through the drawing-room door she was passing on her way to the library, Ashford's voice, level and resistant, and his mother's voice, which was the kind of controlled that bends around an iron will without yielding. She did not pause. She continued to the library and opened the ledgers, and did not think about what she had heard until Mrs. Peel appeared at the library door 2 hours later, with a face arranged in the careful, neutral expression of a woman delivering information she considered distasteful. "Lady Dorothea has invited Miss Ford's family to dine on Thursday," Mrs. Peel said, setting the mid-morning tray on the table's corner with particular precision. Miss Ford and her mother and her uncle, who is a solicitor of some standing in the city. She arranged the cups. "Lady Dorothea has also communicated to the assembled household staff that an announcement of significance is expected." Mina set down her pen. "An announcement." "A betrothal announcement," Mrs. Peel said, and her voice was entirely without inflection. "Between His Grace and Miss Ford." Mina looked at the ledger page in front of her. £300 per year. £12,000 in her document case, legally valid, properly executed. A man at the library table saying, "You were correct," with something in his voice she had not been able to categorize. "Mrs. Peel," she said, "I will need a private half-hour with Mr. Goss before Thursday's dinner." Mrs. Peel looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has been hoping for precisely that sentence. "Mr. Goss arrives on Wednesday afternoon," she said. "He is expected for the conveyance review." "He is expected for the conveyance review," Mina agreed. "Yes, he is." She had written to Goss 6 days earlier, when the ledger audit first made the Duchy's true position apparent to her, and had asked him to verify the instrument's legal standing and their applicability to a formal conveyance proceeding. His reply had arrived on the Monday. His language had been careful, and his conclusion had been clear. The instruments were valid, the Duke's signature on the original agreements was uncontested, and the law provided a straightforward mechanism for their satisfaction by deed of conveyance. Wednesday came. Goss arrived at 4 in the afternoon. A slight man in a black coat, with the unhurried manner of someone who spent his professional life moving between the slow certainties of the law and the fast contingencies of human distress. He met with Mina in the library for an hour and confirmed what his letter had said. The instruments were valid, and their satisfaction by conveyance was legally sound. On Thursday morning, before the house was fully awake, Mina laid out the original instruments on the library table and reviewed each one with the attention she would have given a bridge before crossing it. Her father had sealed them with his personal seal, a small oval device he had used for 31 years, pressing it into red wax at the foot of each document with the practiced speed of a man for whom accuracy was not a special effort, but a continuous one. She aligned them in order of date. She tied them with the piece of gray ribbon she had carried from Hertfordshire in her document case, because her father had tied them that way, and she saw no reason to alter his practice. Then she dressed for dinner. She wore the gray gown again. She had considered whether to wear it, and decided after approximately 2 minutes of consideration that wearing anything else would constitute an argument with a fact that did not require her argument. She was who she was. The gown was what it was. The instruments in her document case were £12,000 sterling and the law's authority, and none of that changed with the color of her dress. She arrived at the dining room at the correct time and took the seat she was shown to, which was, as before, toward the lower end of the table. The company was 30 again, the same count as the first dinner, Lady Dorothea having arranged the occasion with her characteristic sense of audience. Miss Ford was present in a gown of pale gold that caught every candle in the room and returned it amplified, her dark hair dressed with garnets at the temple. She was seated 2 places to the Duke's right, and she wore the particular expression of a woman who has been told, in terms sufficiently clear to constitute certainty, that this evening's proceedings will go in her favor. Ashford was at the head of the table. He had looked at Mina once, briefly, when she entered, and the look had contained something she could not afford to read correctly, so she had not read it at all and had taken her seat. The first course passed. The second course was almost through when Lady Dorothea set down her fork with the specific decisiveness of a woman who has been waiting for a moment she has arranged and has decided the moment has arrived. "We have," she said in the room's clearest voice, "a matter of some happiness to share." She turned toward the head of the table. "A betrothal has been agreed between His Grace the Duke of Meath and Miss Cecily Ford, whose family's connection to the Duchy extends nearly to the previous century. Mr. Goss is among us tonight to oversee the preliminary arrangements." Every face at the table turned to the Duke. Ashford looked at his mother for a long, even moment. He did not confirm. He did not deny. His expression gave nothing. Lady Dorothea continued, because she had not finished, and because she had never left a sentence incomplete in 63 years. "Before we celebrate this happy occasion," she said, her voice dropping precisely one register, into the tone of a woman who considers herself about to perform a public service, "I feel it necessary to raise a matter that bears on the Duchy's governance." She looked down the table toward Mina. "It has come to my attention that the estate ledgers have been altered during the course of the current audit. I am given to understand that specific figures have been recorded incorrectly in ways that would misrepresent the Duchy's obligations and produce, through that misrepresentation, a fraudulent claim of conveyance." She folded her hands on the table. "I say this in company because I believe the company has a right to know the nature of the threat the Duchy is presently under." The room was entirely silent. 30 faces did what they had done before. They processed, calculated, and looked, most of them, at anything except Mina. Mina set down her fork. She took a breath that she kept perfectly controlled. She said, in a voice that did not require raising, "May I speak?" Lady Dorothea inclined her head by a fraction. "The ledgers have not been altered," Mina said. "I have no access to the ledgers outside the library's working hours, which are recorded by Mrs. Peel and the head footman. I have recorded what I found. What I found is accurate." She paused. "The figures in the ledgers, which I have not altered, show an annual income of £300 against obligations that have been compounding for 22 years. The Duchy is insolvent. That is not a conclusion I have manufactured. That is an arithmetic conclusion available to anyone in this room who can read a balance." She opened the document case that she had placed on the chair beside her before sitting down, because she had known, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent 11 days inside an insolvent house, with a woman whose confidence was organized entirely around preventing its exposure, that this moment would come. She laid the instruments on the table in front of Mr. Goss. "My father," she said, "was Thomas Anderson, solicitor, of Ashford Lane, Hertfordshire. He held these instruments for 19 years. They bear the Duchy's signature and seal at the foot of each. They have never been satisfied. Mr. Goss examined them on Wednesday afternoon. I would ask Mr. Goss to confirm their validity to this company." Goss did not need to pick them up. He had read them 2 days earlier. "They are valid," he said, in the brief way of a man who knows that brevity is the law's most useful quality. "They represent an aggregate debt of £12,000, unsatisfied and properly executed, against the Duchy of Meath. The instruments entitle the holder to seek satisfaction by conveyance under the applicable statutory provisions. The instruments are in order." The room was silent in a different way than it had been silent before. This silence was the kind that happens when 30 people simultaneously understand that the weight of the evening has shifted, and that the person sitting near the lower end of the table in the gray gown is not where the weight was expected to land." Lady Dorothea's hands, still folded on the table, did not move. Something behind her eyes moved, briefly, in the direction of recalculation. She had been so entirely certain. "Miss Anderson," she began. "The instruments are valid," Ashford said. His voice was quiet, level, and final. He had not raised it. He had not needed to. Every face at the table turned to him. He had pushed back his chair and risen, not with the theatrics of a man performing a reversal, but with the particular deliberateness of a man who has made a decision that cost him something and is not going to perform the cost. He looked down the table toward Mina, and his expression was not what 30 people in that room had expected to see on a duke's face when looking at a woman in a plain gray gown. "Miss Anderson's audit is accurate," he said. "The ledgers are unaltered. The debt is valid. The instruments are sound." He paused for the space of one full breath. "Mr. Goss will prepare the deed of conveyance. Meredith Hall passes to Miss Anderson in legal satisfaction of the debt." Miss Ford made a small sound. It was not precisely a word. Lady Dorothea said, "Ashford." Just the name, stripped of its title, the word a mother produces when a son has done something she cannot yet comprehend. "The announcement of a betrothal," he said to his mother, with a care that was not unkind, "was yours, not mine. There will be no such announcement." The colonel who had sat beside Mina at the first dinner looked at his plate. The young wife on Mina's other side looked at her water-glass. Miss Ford's uncle, the city solicitor, examined the tablecloth with the professional attention of a man who has attended enough contractual reversals to know when one is complete. Lady Dorothea's composure held for another moment, the long-trained discipline of a woman who had organized 63 years around the correct social form. Then, very quietly, it released, not into anger or protest, but into a kind of exhausted recognition. A single clause written on her face that said, simply, that she had known the Duchy's numbers as well as anyone, and had spent 20 years not looking at them directly, and that the woman near the lower end of the table had looked at them without flinching, and told the truth in a room of 30 people, and that there was no hierarchy-protected argument to make against that. She said nothing further. Goss spent the following morning preparing the conveyance document at the library table, which he had commandeered with Mina's permission, working through the morning in the orderly way of a man for whom the transfer of an estate was a procedural matter rather than a dramatic one. Mrs. Peel brought the mid-morning tray and set it beside him without comment, and brought a separate tray to the small sitting room off the east corridor where Mina was waiting, because she had understood, with the long-service knowledge of a woman who had watched the house from within for 22 years, that this particular morning was not one Mina should spend at the library table. Mina sat in the east corridor sitting room and drank her tea, and did not think about what she was going to do with Meredith Hall, because that was a problem that could be addressed when the document was signed, and not before. Ashford came to the sitting-room door at 10:30. He did not enter without being asked. He stood at the door with the frame at his shoulder, a man who had grown up in this house and was learning, in this particular morning's specific light, that it was no longer his to enter as he chose. There was something in that awareness that showed in his face. Not grief, precisely, and not relief, but the specific expression of a man who has carried a weight so long that setting it down does not feel light. It feels strange. "The instrument satisfied," he said. "My father's debt, and his father's before it. You have cleared a claim that was never going to be cleared any other way." He paused. "I am not certain that thanks is the right word. Perhaps acknowledgement." "Acknowledgement will do," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that gave nothing, and were, this morning, giving something anyway. The way a seam in stone gives water under pressure without meaning to. "Your father was a thorough man," he said. "He was," she said. "He taught me to be the same." "He succeeded," Ashford said, and there was something in the plainness of it, the simple, accurate statement, that landed differently than a compliment would have landed, because it was not a compliment. It was a recognition. It was a man who had spent 11 days dismissing a woman telling her, in 4 words, that he had been wrong. She held his gaze long enough to let the recognition settle. "The deed," he said after a moment, "gives you the hall, and the home farm, and the north parcels. It does not require you to remain in residence." He paused. "I will need to make arrangements for my mother's dower portion. That is a matter Goss can address." "I am aware," she said. "Miss Anderson." He said her name with a precision that placed each syllable exactly where it belonged. Wilhelmina. He had used her given name once before, the previous evening at the dinner table, when he had spoken those 4 words in front of 30 witnesses, and she had registered the use of it at the time as a significant act, a deliberate crossing of a register that cost him something, and she registered it again now in the sitting room's morning quiet. "I owe you a further acknowledgement, a specific one." She waited. "At the first dinner," he said. "The remark about the gown." He did not look away from her, which she respected. "It was without cause, and without justice, and I am aware that saying so now, after the evening's proceedings, appears to be correction rather than genuine acknowledgement. I offer it as both, and leave the reception of it to your judgment." She considered him. She considered the portrait turned to the wall in the East Gallery. The portrait she had not asked Mrs. Peel to restore, and would not ask anyone to restore, because that choice was his, and not hers to make. She considered her father's grey ribbon around the instruments that had constituted £12,000 and 20 years of his patient faith in the law. She considered a child named Agnes standing in a courtyard with her chin up and her hands flat at her coat seams, enduring, and the man at the window above watching someone go down and stand beside her. "I receive it as both," she said. He nodded, once, with the grave economy of a man who does not perform what he means. He held her gaze for one additional moment, a moment that was not quite the library's 40 minutes of shared arithmetic, and not quite the corridor's accidental proximity, and not quite anything she had a name for yet. And then he said, "I will be in the library if Goss requires me," and left the doorway. She sat for a while longer in the East Corridor sitting room, with her hands around her cooling teacup, and listened to the house. It was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Not the quiet of a building that was finished, but the quiet of one that was very still between one state and the next, holding its breath the way a room holds its breath when someone has just said an irrevocable thing. The conveyance was signed at noon. Mrs. Peel witnessed it, standing beside the library table in her gray dress and her white cap with the expression of a woman who has waited 22 years for the house's arithmetic to be addressed and is now watching it addressed and is determined not to show how much this matters to her. She did show it, slightly, in the particular care with which she signed her name, as though her signature were a permanent endorsement of a thing she had privately endorsed for a long time. Goss departed by the 2 o'clock post. Miss Ford and her mother and her uncle had departed that morning before breakfast, with the swift, quiet efficiency of guests who have comprehended that an occasion has not gone in the direction they were invited to witness. Lady Dorothea withdrew to her rooms after a brief meeting with Ashford, and when Mrs. Peel brought her afternoon tray, she found the dowager seated at the window with her hands still in her lap, and her silver hair precisely dressed, and her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who has spent 63 years being correct about everything, and has spent the last 18 hours adjusting to the discovery that one thing had been otherwise. By late afternoon, the snow had thickened. Mina was in the library when she became aware of it, looking up from the conveyance document she had been reviewing with the calm attention of a woman who intends to understand exactly what she holds, and finding the west window white with it, the parkland gone entirely soft and gray-white under a sky that had darkened early and sent down snow with the unhurried certainty of a season that had decided to begin. She went to the window. The ha-ha wall was already smoothed over. The gravel drive was white. The great oak at the park center stood in a silence that was not absence, but presence, the way old trees stand in new snow, as though the snow has simply reminded them of something they already knew. She heard a footstep in the doorway behind her. "It will cover the north road by morning," Ashford said. He was at the library door, still in his coat, as though he had come in from outside recently and not yet removed it. There were snowflakes in his dark hair, melting. "You will not be able to leave tomorrow if it continues." "I had not yet decided when to leave," she said. He came to stand beside her at the window. Not close, precisely, but within the range of warmth, the way two people stand when they have stopped requiring a reason to stand near each other. They looked at the snow together for a moment without speaking, and in that silence there was more said than a conversation would have carried, the kind of communication that moves in the body's small adjustments, a breath released, a shoulder's tension, a heartbeat settling from its previous pace into something steadier. "There is a matter," he said after a while, "that I have been considering since last night." He kept his eyes on the parkland. "The deed is yours, and that is correct and final. The hall is yours. I have no interest in disputing a legal instrument that my own family's choices produced." He paused. "I have an interest, however, in understanding whether you intend to take up residence." "That depends," she said. "On what?" She considered the snow. She considered the library table behind them, covered in ledger pages that she had reorganized with the particular satisfaction of bringing order to something that had been disordered for too long. She considered Mrs. Peel's signature written carefully on the conveyance document, and Agnes in the courtyard, and 40 minutes over reconciled figures with a man who asked follow-up questions more precise than his first ones. "On whether the house intends to make good use of someone who can read a balance," she said. He turned to look at her. The gray eyes that had been giving nothing for 11 days were giving everything now, quietly, in the way that restraint gives way when the reason for it has been removed. "The house," he said with the same grave plainness he had used all morning, "has been in need of precisely that for considerably longer than 11 days. "Yes," she said. "I know. I have been reading the ledgers." His expression arrived at the thing that had crossed his face once before in the library and that she had not had a category for. It was not quite amusement, and was something older than that. Something that had been waiting behind the years of calcified discipline for the right occasion to surface. It warmed his face entirely and briefly, and then settled into a kind of quiet. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. The Duke's hand, offered across the library table's corner, not in the formal manner of assistance, but in the direct manner of a man who means exactly the gesture he is making. She thought of her father pressing the instruments into her hands and telling her, with the careful precision of a man whose whole life had been spent working in accurate language, that she was his executor and the Duchy's creditor, and that the law was on her side. The law had been on her side. Her father had known the law. She had not known. When she drove up the Marath Drive 11 days ago, in her traveling coat and her plain dark bonnet with her document case on the seat beside her, that the law would deliver her to a library window. In first snow, with a man who had been carrying the wrong kind of silence for 6 years, and who had just, quietly and without further ceremony, stopped carrying it. She placed her hand in his. Outside, the snow continued to fall across the parkland, patient and even, filling in the old geometry of the drive and the ha-ha wall and the paths between the estate's dependencies. The great oak stood in it. The home farm's 400 acres lay under it. The north parcels that the ledgers had recorded in their correct figures waited quietly for a spring that was still months away, but would, when it arrive into a house that had finally had its arithmetic addressed. Mrs. Peel came to the library door with the evening tray at 5:30, found the room occupied in a way she had not precisely expected, but had not been entirely unprepared for. Set the tray down on the table's corner with the careful respect of a woman who understands that some moments are not hers, to interrupt, and went back down the passage toward the kitchen. She was humming. The library fire crackled once, settling into its own warmth, and the snow went on falling outside the window, and the deed lay on the table where it had been placed at noon, Mina's name written on it in Mr. Goss's neat clerk's hand, Ashford's signature below it in the level discipline he brought to everything, and the wax seal, cool and exact and final, at the foot of the page. Marath Hall was quiet. It was the quiet of a house that has been still between one state and the next, and has finally, with the weight of a season's first snow on its old stone roof, settled into what comes after. If this story found its way to you tonight, leave a thought in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. There are more stories like this one waiting, and they come more often when you are here.